So, hey everybody, welcome to chapter 20, Late Medieval and Early Renaissance Northern Europe. And as you start these chapter videos, a couple things I'd encourage you to keep in mind. Number one, make sure that you've pulled up and are looking at the art checklist. So that way you'll know which artworks I really want you to focus on and really pay attention to. And you can also follow the video that way. And if you're stopping and starting the video, you can look on that art checklist and go, oh, he stopped at that painting, and kind of know where to pick up the video and go on from there. No reason to watch these videos straight through. Break them down, watch them in chunks. So the videos are going to follow the textbook. They're going to be based on the textbook. So I'd really encourage you do the video first and then read and study the chapter in the textbook. So that way, as you're reading the textbook, you'll know again, hey, these are the artworks to focus on. These are the ideas he wants me to focus on and that kind of stuff. And then I was just going to mention to you for Arts 1304, it's the second half of the textbook. So in Arts 1303, you may have already taken that or you're not going to have it all. And that's fine. Don't worry about that. But I'll talk about things and I'll say, oh, that was earlier art or that was something like that. And you'll go, oh, I wish I kind of knew where that fit together because it's from the earlier art and it's also from the first half of the textbook. Don't worry, you'll understand what I'm talking about as long as you pay attention to anything. You'll get it, but just wanted you to be aware of that because in a couple of chapters from now, I'll be referring back to the part we're doing now, and because that's how art works. We compare things to other things a lot. So you'll see that pop up. So late medieval, early Renaissance, Northern Europe, we're talking about in about the 1400s, and we're talking about in Europe. And I'll show you on the map here, we're talking about the part of Europe which is north of the Alps. So this is a topographical map. The bottom, it shows you Italy. I put the names on there. It shows you Italy. And we'll be talking about that a lot in the next couple of chapters, the country of Italy and all the little parts that made up that. And then the Alps are the mountains there, the big mountain range. They really separate the top part, which is also Europe, from the bottom part. So if an artist was north of the Alps, up in France, for example, I put France up there, but Germany is up there, et cetera, et cetera. Other countries are up there as well. They were learning different things. They were exposed to different things. They were having different experience. So you want to know, are we north of the Alps, France, England, Germany, et cetera? Are we south of the Alps? That's how these chapters are broken down. So for this chapter, we're north of the Alps. And then the next chapter, we'll be talking about the same time period, but we'll be south of the Alps. So you'll see this more and more as we go through these first few chapters. So let me show you a couple other maps. Maps are important when we study history because we talk a lot about how one artist learned from another or how her style or something influenced other places. Our daughter right now is here and she lives in London. And she's like, oh, this is how people are dressing in London now. And it's like, then things show up in the United States and it kind of catches up with that and vice versa. So it's the same way in art. People learn from other people. So where they're living makes a difference. So we want to know as we're doing this first chapter, chapter 20, here's a kind of blown up version of Europe in the 1400s. Okay. So there's the bigger map. You see France, you see the Alps, you see Italy, and we're getting a little bit closer in. So you see France, and in the bottom, like I said, you can see it doesn't actually say Italy. It says Papal States. And I know it's hard to read this map. It's got Venice because those are all parts of what Italy was then. And then the Alps are in the center. And then I go to the top there. I've got France with some other little countries in it. I've got the Holy Roman Empire. Then you want to know there's a little tiny part near the top where it says Flanders. Next to where it says English Channels. We're going to be talking about Flanders a lot because it was a really big deal for the art world. So we call it Flanders. That's the name of the country. Or we'll talk about Flemish art. So when that comes up in this video, that's where we're talking about. In the next couple of chapters, we'll talk more about that region. We also call it the Low Countries. So we'll come back and revisit that. But it's a big deal because there's a lot of money that flows through there. There's a lot of trade, okay? So over in England, there's a lot of sheep. So they do a lot of wool, and then they would bring it to Flanders and they would make it into fabric. And there was so much money in that. And then banking, we'd just go to the bank, right? We just use our ATM or whatever, our debit card. But banking was actually a very sophisticated system of keeping track who owed what to whom. They weren't actually carrying around a bunch of gold money all the time. They were actually coming up with the ways that they could trade. And then the bankers were also getting rich from being in charge of the banks. And that'll pop up again in the next couple of chapters as well. So you want to know there's a lot of money. There's a lot of money where they could afford to buy art and pay for buildings and different things like that. So you'll see that popping up. Now here's something else we want to know as we're starting 1304. The first few chapters are focused on Europe. So this is what Europe looks like today. Okay, so if I go over today, that's where the countries are located. So the names have changed a little bit and everything. But here's some key ideas. So if you'll please make sure you have this in your brain and in your awareness, there's something called nation states that happens in the 1300s, 1400s, 1500s, etc. So for example, if I say 1776, you're like, oh yeah, United States, Declaration of Independence, etc. Okay, so in Europe, in North America, other places, the smaller little broken up little tiny countries and little bits and pieces started to come together in the modern nation states. They became a lot more powerful. They became a lot more organized. They had to come up with things like banking systems and how you had an army, things like that. So that's a big change. That's a massive change. It affects European history. It affects the history of North and South America because our nation states come out of, the time period that the Dutch and the French and the English and the Portuguese and all those folks are over in the Americas. So all those nation states come out of that, but it also affects the way this money, this wealth is flowing around. So new people are getting rich. Before the rise of the nation states, the wealth would have been with the kings and queens a lot, and it would have been a lot with the church, the Roman Catholic Church. Now these merchants are making all this money from trade. These bankers, like I said, banks make a lot of money. Guilds are trade guilds. So like the Guild of the Painters or the Guild of the Silversmiths or different trade groups that get together, they were making money. So they also now have the money to support the kings and queens, royalty, the church, the Roman Catholic Church, in supporting the arts. And again, this is one of these things, like I said, if you went back to the prior Arts 1303 and you saw the art from 1100s, 1200s, in there's a lot of talk about art was done for this church. Art was done because this king ordered it. As we're doing 1304, we'll see more and more private people who have made their own money are buying the artwork and supporting art. So please keep that in mind because that'll go through the next several chapters. I'm bringing it up now, but it'll go through the next several chapters. The other thing I want you to know, I have this map up, is for the rest of the semester, we'll talk about like Italian art, okay? Or we'll talk about like French art. So you can see where those countries are today. I won't typically be going and saying, oh, art of the Papal States, which is on the bottom of the map next to Rome there, or art of the independent Republic of Venice, which is on the map. That's just convenience for us. At the time, these were really separate countries, okay? Flanders was a really separate country. But most of the time today, we're talking about art, we talk about it, about the country that it would have been in today, not the country it would have been in the past, because it might have had a different name or different things like that. So if you ever get confused, look in your textbook. It's clear in there. It's clear in there. Look in your textbook and say, I'm definitely, before you take a test, make sure you know, hey, what country is where? If we're talking about Flemish art, how does that fit in? Things like that, just so you're keeping clear on what's where. Okay. Last thing I want to talk about as a starting point for the next several chapters are what we call media. So media, that's the material that artists use. So when artists are painting, there's three basic tools that artists have used over the centuries to paint. And we're mostly going to see oil on canvas. So on the screen right now, that's the one on the right. These are just samples I put on the screen, okay? If you go to Museum of Fine Arts Houston with me, which I hope you can do, we'll also see some tempera paintings. So in the center there, that's like finger paints when your little finger paints are kind of chalky, okay? And we call it egg tempera because eggs used to make it a sticky paint. So tempera is very different than oil on canvas. And then fresco, when like the Sistine Chapel ceiling was painted. Fresco is like when you have a sheetrock, if you're familiar with sheetrock in a house, it's kind of a chalky substance if you actually look at the actual sheetrock. Fresco is basically taking that same kind of chalky substance, mixing colors with it, and then pasting it or painting it on rock walls, like the stone walls of a church. Okay, that's fresco. So in Arts 1303, we have a lot of fresco paintings. We have a lot of tempera paintings. Now in history, the history of art, 1400s, 1500s, we get this new media, this new material that becomes much more popular and more prominent, and it's oil painting, particularly oil painting on canvas. So you'll see more about that, and you'll hear more about that as we go through this. And it's also, there's a very good description in your textbook. I'm doing a short version here, but comparing fresco and tempera and oil painting. So particularly if you're an art major or what we call a studio major, if you're going to be a painter yourself, you really, really want to know this history, because these are all tools that artists can still use today. So please know that oil on canvas, we'll be talking a lot in the next several chapters about the new oil painting. So by new, we mean as comparison to the older tempera painting and the older fresco painting, okay? And it's hard to show on screen. If you get to go to the museum, I can show you a tempera and I can show you an oil painting. We'll see a lot of stuff there, and the difference will really pop out at you, much more so than it does when you're just seeing it in a screen show. Here's why the artists like oil painting so much. Here's why it was such an amazing new tool. So it's mostly in Northern Europe that it gets adopted, north of the Alps, okay? What you can do with oil painting much better than fresco or tempera is you can get these really glowing colors, just these like the red and the blues in here. The one on the right here, okay, that's a later painting. See that bright red in his cape and the green underneath, and see how those colors are saturated, they're intense, they're really popping out. The ones on the left, the fresco and tempera, they're bright and they're colorful, but see how they feel more like a pastel color? So you get these really intense saturated colors. You can also get what we call lower values. You get much darker colors. Fresco and tempera, they don't really like to be dark. It just doesn't work that well. On the oil painting, you can see how the background is extremely dark, and the young man on the left there, the clothing is a dark brown that he has on. So I can get warm glowing colors, I can get darker colors. A couple other things that I can do that aren't going to show up at all in the video. I can't show you where it'll make sense to you. But if you look at skin, if you look at your forearm right now, look at your wrist, okay, where you can see the veins, where they check your pulse, right? That's what we call translucent, because I can actually see through my own skin to see the veins. So oil paint, because it's a different substance, it's a different material, I can put it on in very thin layers. It's called glazing. Glazing means like a window, okay? It's the idea I could see through it, just like I can see through skin. So I can make the paint transparent where you're seeing through it, or I can make it translucent, what's like a shower curtain, where it's that little fuzzy kind of thing, you kind of see through it. You can't do that with fresco or tempera. So I can do these layers of paint. Again, you're not seeing it on the screen. You're not seeing, but if you saw it in person, you would see these layers of screen. So the light goes through those layers and bounces back out. So it gives you this beautiful glowing effect, and then it can appear more real. We call that naturalism, okay? And then there's a specific term as you're writing your essay, your formal elements essay, you'll be learning the term implied texture, okay? So implied texture isn't that this woman has the fabric on, the Virgin Mary there on the left. Okay, it's all paint, right? It's all paint, but it looks like this crinkly blue fabric, or the floor looks like this hard stone, or his cape on the right looks like that crinkly red fabric, or their hair, the other details that you'll see through it. Or the man here, you see his beard on the right, it looks like that soft thing, or the fur on his cape. Those are what we call implied texture. So I can do much more implied texture with oil paint than I can with tempera or fresco. There's still implied texture in the fresco, the one on the far left, but it's not as convincing. It doesn't have, again, what we call this naturalism. It doesn't have that realistic appearance. Here's the other thing that's a really big deal with oil paint. So please make sure you keep this in mind. It's massively important for artists. My wife paints with oil paint. She loves this stuff, okay? Most people today do not, but she does. With oil paints, they don't dry as fast. Fresco, like I said, is basically sheetrock, okay, mixed with pigment, mixed with the color of the paint. And if you took sheetrock and you got it wet, it's going to dry up pretty fast. Tempera is mixed actually with egg to make it sticky. Egg dries up super fast. So I got to change it right away or fix it. Oil paint, I can come back a day later, or even later than that. I can scrape it off and I can start it over again. So I can alter it, I can change it. It's a new flexibility, okay? So again, this is in your textbook. I'm giving you the short version, but if you look in your textbook, there's a really, really good description of tempera and oil painting to talk about why this is such an incredibly important material for artists use. So please know about oil painting, not just this chapter, but really as we go through the first 2/3 of our textbook this semester. When we talk about oils, it means something to us. Here's the first artwork that we're covering as we're going through the art checklist. So the one on the left is the one we're talking about. The one on the right, I put that in for comparison. That's an earlier artwork. So the one on the left is Klaus Schluter, The Well of Moses, okay? 1396 to 1406. So as I go through the slides, that's how you can check which one I'm talking about. I won't read all the labels underneath it, but that's how you can see which one we're talking about. So this is the Well of Moses. It's in Dijon, France. So we know it's north of the Alps, okay? This thing was massive. Parts of it still survive today, parts are gone. So we're only seeing a part of it. This is the bottom of the Well of Moses, and up above it was Jesus and some other things. And then the water came flowing down. So symbolically, the blood of Jesus was coming down from the New Testament to the prophets and the saints from the Old Testament. So enormous symbolism in this, okay? Enormous symbolism. And so here's a couple things I want you to know about it. In the medieval time period, that is the Middle Ages, and then into the early Renaissance that we'll be talking about more, there was a thing called mystery plays. And so if you've ever seen people, basically it was cosplay, if you know what cosplay is. Basically it was like a static version of cosplay. People would dress up like something from the Bible, and then they would stand there and other people would walk by and see them. And it was called mystery plays, the idea of the mystery of the life of Jesus, okay? And so they would put them on stages that were tilted. So you could actually it's like if I've got a monitor and I'd tilt it so I can see the screen better, they would actually tilt the physical stage. So you want to know mystery plays, or the idea of acting out. And then we want to know that the one on the left, the newer one, if you would have seen it in France, and then you've gone to Chartres Cathedral, which is also in France. So the artwork on the right is about, 250 years earlier. See how those figures, the ones on the right, are stiff and rigid? You can tell they're people and they've got arms and heads, but they don't look like people who are moving and twisting and turning. And I particularly look at Moses on the left. He's the guy with the horn on his head, okay? So he's the center figure of the three that we're seeing. See how his body looks like it's curving, it's shifting? That's what we call contrapposto. There's a weight shift there. So we want to know this new art of the Renaissance is getting more naturalistic, what we call naturalism, okay? More realistic, but we use the term naturalism than what we saw before. So that's your first artwork. As your starting art's 1304, that's the first artwork that we talk about. Here's the next one that we want to see. This is the two artists, brothers named the Limbourg brothers. And they would create, among other things, what are called Book of Hours. Here's how Book of Hours work. So pick up your cell phone, if you got it in front of you, and think how you hold your cell phone. Okay, and then think how your cell phone communicates things to you. That's what they're doing with the Book of Hours. So a Book of Hours were little religious books. They were tiny. This is one that we're seeing on the screen right now, 9 inches by 5 inches. And they told people as you went through the year, here's when you should say your prayers and what prayers you should say. And just like we walk around with our cell phone and we're pretty comfortable with it, we sort of hold it in our hand. It's very personal. It's not for other people to see, basically. That's how a Book of Hours work. So this is personal artwork. It's not public art. And I know on the screen it's hard to see because it's lots of teeny tiny details in it, but you want to know, of course, it's handmade. This is before printing. This is before printing exists. So it was super expensive, both because you had to hand make it and because you're using very expensive colors. Blue was super expensive. Blue was a really, really pricey thing. And then also gold was expensive. If you have golden artwork. And again, when you go to Museum of Fine Arts Houston, I can show you some of that gold. It doesn't show it all on the screen. It just looks kind of like yellow, but it's actually shiny like gold. Okay. So this was a really, really expensive little book, this Book of Hours, and it's called Les Très Riches du Berry, which means the rich hours of the Duc de Berry. So it's telling us, hey, this is for praying and being religious, but it's also rich hours, just like it sounds like, expensive, an expensive little book. So these are some of the most famous pages from any book of prayers, okay? From any Book of Hours, excuse me. The one we're seeing on the screen right now, another one we're going to see. There's other ones that were done, but this is kind of the most famous. And he was like brother to the king, the guy who this was done for and stuff like that. So these calendar pictures are some of the most famous. A couple other things you want to know about this. This is important. One, you want to know the book goes between the nobility. So January, for example, is the nobility, kings and queens, stuff like that. And then the other pages are the peasants, are the regular working class people. So this one from October, for example, are the ordinary working people. That was something different. And the last thing, and if you're writing this down or if you're typing or however you do this, really, really underline and say to where it says spatial recession. That means that unlike the art that came before it in the Middle Ages, the time period for it, we're now starting to get where people are shown like they're moving through space. Of course, any painting is flat, but you can create the illusion of space. And we'll be talking about that a lot more. So don't worry if this is not making sense right now, but just know that in this, compared to what would have come before, you now have the more of an idea of space. And if you looked in your textbook and get a good quality reproduction of the one I have on screen right now, you could see that there's horses and riders, and you could see, oh, they're in the background, they're further back, and then there's people walking towards. The other reason this one's a nice one to start that idea, because that's going to be hugely important, the idea of putting space in artwork, the illusion of space. The other reason it's nice is they're actually being told to come forward for this feast, okay? So they're actually being told, the man on the right with the fur hat on and then the blue clothing that he's wearing, the guy on the right, they're actually being told, hey, come forward to the feast. So it's not only the idea of the illusion of space, but they're actually being told to move through the space. So please know, Le Très Richeuse, you're not going to have to memorize the title, but Le Très Richeuse, the Duc de Berry, this incredibly pretty little book, not very big, but really, really pretty. So a couple other things to know here. And again, this will make more sense as we go through the next chapters, but you want to know that the figures here, the people painted, are now making shadows. And I know that sounds like, yeah, okay, but shadows make things look more three-dimensional, look more like they're moving through space. So that's why that's important, that we have this new naturalism, okay, with the details being put in and then with shadows. Now you want to be clear, details don't make things look more real. I can have super detailed work, super specific, lots and lots of details. That automatically makes something look more natural or more real, but it can depending on how you do your details. Okay, so please be aware that the Book of Hours this particular Book of Hours goes through the different months and goes through the different times of the year. So you have a book that each day is telling you, here's what prayers to say today, and it's also like literally taking you through the year. The top part there, I didn't put the notes about this, but the top part, if you're familiar with the zodiac, that whole thing, that's what's going on up in the top. And you can see the blue color, right? You can see it's expensive. And then the chariot of the sun is going through the year. That's what's in the top part there. So these were incredibly sophisticated books. They've got their religious part, but they also have basically what we would think of as science, tracking the seasons and that kind of stuff. Last thing about this one's just kind of cool. If you go to Paris today, the most famous museum in Paris is the Louvre Museum, okay? And the Mona Lisa is in the Louvre, for example. So the Louvre was the castle, one of the castles for the kings of France before it was turned into an art museum. So this is right in this, what today is right in the center of Paris, okay, where this field is, where these guys are. But that's the Louvre Museum in the background. At that point, of course, it's still a castle, right? But so please know the Louvre Castle, which is then turned into a museum, right there in the back of that one. Okay, so this again is a small altarpiece. Like I said, the Book of Hours, teeny tiny. Okay, some of the artwork is going to be big. That's why I want to know about the difference here. So look on this screen. Look on the screen, and this is what we call a triptych. It has 3 parts to it. So please know with these little altarpieces, are the big altarpieces, a lot of times they were open and closed. A lot of times they were kept closed. And we'll be talking about that more in a few minutes, okay? So we're seeing gold frames. A lot of times the frames are damaged and replaced and stuff. We're seeing gold frames, then we're seeing a center painting, and then we're seeing the 2 side paintings. And I could close it, right? And then the whole thing would be closed. A lot of times there's art on the outside. So this is what we call a triptych. I can have a diptych, which means 2 pieces, or a triptych. So that'll show up again with these altar pieces I'll be talking about here in a minute. And then if I do a triptych, I can do 3 separate stories. So on the left, and I'll show you another screen with the text on it in a minute, so don't worry if you don't get all the names here. On the left, that's what we call donor portraits. So this is private. It means it wasn't done for a church. It means it was done for this wealthy family. So often somebody pays for something, they're also in the artwork. So on the left, the man and the husband and wife are kneeling and looking at the story in the center. And then that's Mary in the center there being told she's going to have baby Jesus. That's called the Annunciation. Okay. And we'll come back and talk about that a little bit more. And then on the right, Mary is married to Joseph, Mary and Joseph in the Bible, and then they have baby Jesus. So Joseph is on the right there. So see how I've got three stories that connect. The people on the left, they're looking through a door, right, to what's happening in the center. And then Joseph is over there in his workshop. He's a carpenter, so he's making mousetraps because it's to catch the devil. The symbolism is to catch the devil, okay? So that's what's happening. So we're going to mostly focus on the one in the center, but please know there's the other two parts to it as well. And you would see that in these altar pieces, okay? They wouldn't just be one piece. Like we think of a painting as just being in a frame, but they were used to multiple pieces. So again, this is still Flemish artists. Okay, we're in Flanders, Flemish artists. Private altarpiece, like I said, donor portraits. You want to know the term Annunciation. For these first few chapters, that's going to come up over and over again. The Annunciation means Mary is being told by the angel Gabriel she's going to have baby Jesus. Okay, so very important in Christian art. And so we also call it the virgin birth because she's a virgin, but she's told she'll have baby Jesus. So basically everything in this center part of the altarpiece, okay, plus some other things, some other details in there, have to do with this story of the Annunciation and are really focused on the idea of Mary being a virgin, okay, this idea of Mary's purity. So Mary is usually shown reading a book. That'll show up and over again. So the idea is that she's reading the prophecies that are talking about that Jesus is going to be born to a virgin, okay? So the book is important. It's this idea of reading what we would call the Old Testament, okay? A candle is another symbol of Mary. And you go through stuff and you're like, yeah, if I went to a Christmas celebration somewhere, I'd have the candle, or if Easter and Christmas combined, I'd have the candle. The lilies, right? We still have lilies with Easter. So these are all symbols of purity. Let me show you two that may be a little more subtle that I really, really want you to know. One is the idea of a garden. So the walled garden symbolized Mary's virginity, okay, that it was this closed off garden, okay, that people weren't entering it, just like the idea Mary is still a virgin, has, not had relations, okay? So the garden was a symbol of Mary. Then the other symbol that shows up over and over again is the idea of glass, okay? So I can have a glass vase, I can have glass windows, I can have both, because the idea that something goes through glass, but it doesn't break the glass. So Mary can have baby Jesus while she still stays a virgin. So glass is going to show up over and over again. So I mentioned Joseph. And the last thing, which I know you can't see, but if you look in the textbook, you may be able to pick this out. Mary's being told at the moment of the Annunciation, she's basically told, hey, you're going to become pregnant now. Okay. It's like going to happen really, really quickly. So on the left, there is baby Jesus. He's coming through the glass window, right? Because it's not broken. And he's got his little cross with him. So if you look this up in the textbook or look it up, you'll see it up there. So Annunciation, you want to know that's Mary being announced, then all the symbolism that goes into it. So people could read these, people understood the symbolism. It was not a surprise to them. They knew what it meant. Last thing I didn't put it in the notes, but let me mention, you see how that table is really tilted? You'll see that showing up in some other artwork. It doesn't look like it's flat. It looks like it's tilted up towards us. You'll see that showing up in some other artwork. So kind of keep that in mind as well. It's kind of like the mystery play thing that I talked about, where the screen, the actual stage was tilted. It's like a painted version of that. Okay, this is the artist Jan van Eyck, and we're going to see a couple of different artworks by him. So he's still Flemish. We're still in that little tiny part of Europe. Here's what's important. Here's what's really new about this. So let me give you a little bit of history, okay? You don't have to remember the details, but I just want you to know, if you didn't have Arts 1303, you had the Greeks, and then you had the Roman Empire. And we've all heard of the Roman Empire, right? I was talking to my daughter yesterday about the meme about how often do people think of the Roman Empire, if you're familiar with that. So the Roman Empire, of course, was real, and it ended in the year about 400, so about 1600 years ago, okay? And then you got what we call the Middle Ages, and we studied that. The people in the 1400s were saying, we're looking back to the Roman Empire and the Greek art that came before. We'll talk about this more in the next several chapters, but I just want to make sure you got your timeline here. So they would, and they could literally see the Greek and Roman stuff. It hadn't disappeared. They could still see some of the architecture in particular. So they were using that for influence and inspiration. So when it says first time in 1,000 years, first in 1,000 years, look in at the viewer, that's exactly what we mean. When people were making art showing portraits, like the donor portrait on the left, they weren't shown looking out at us. Okay, that seems weird to us because, like, hey, I'm gonna, pull out my phone, take your picture. It's always like, look at me, right? That's kind of how we think. But they weren't shown looking at us. That just wasn't done in the Middle Ages. So this is the first time in 1,000 years that we have a painting where the person's shown looking out at us. And the reason that's important is it shows pride. It shows you're connecting with the world. It's less religious, okay? And again, if you went through all the Arts 1303 stuff, you'd kind of have this whole backstory of what I'm talking about here. So just be aware, major, major change. When we say first time in 1,000 years, that's exactly what we mean. It's not like, hyperbole. We mean this is a major, major look back to the Greek and Roman stuff. And then what's kind of fun about this one is the frame itself. Again, I said frames get beat up, they get damaged, all sorts of stuff happens to them because it just does, okay? But this actually has the original frame on the top, okay? On the top, it says, as I can, in a different language, but that's what it says. And then on the bottom, it says in Latin, Jan van Eyck made me. And then it gives some details about the dates and stuff, okay? So that's like the ultimate, like, showing off, right? I'm making my artwork. It may be a portrait of myself, okay? We'll talk about that more with some other portrait. It may be an actual image of me, the person painting it. But I'm also putting on the frame as I can do this, right? I can handle it. And I made this. So please know that that's a big deal. That's a big shift from artists being very much like, I'm working for the church. This is religious. I don't want to be prideful, to this guy looking at us. He's got the stubble. If you look at the one on the right there, the close up, he's got the stubble of his beard and stuff and seeing us. Now, the self-portrait thing, when a painting is done before photography, when a painting is done and somebody really makes eye contact, we don't always know. It can always be a portrait of whoever said, hey, I want you to paint me. But sometimes that and other information can give us an idea that maybe the artist painted himself or herself. And sometimes they tell us, sometimes they'll actually write on their own portrait. And the other reason you want to know that is it was a really good way for an artist to practice, okay? So you had to get good before people would pay you. And so when you were doing practice stuff and you needed to practice painting pictures of people, one of the easier things to do was do a painting of yourself. So it was also sometimes a practice tool. So, but again, it's before photography, so we can't pull up a bunch of photos and compare them, right? But we think this may be a self-portrait of Jan van Eyck. So know Jan van Eyck. He's a super, super important person north of the Alps in the 1400s. And here's the reason. We don't get to do a whole ton of art from any artist, but this is a really physically big artwork, and it's a really important artwork for this time period. So this is an altarpiece. So we're seeing it closed, okay? So I talked about opening and closing. We're seeing it closed. The frames got damaged long ago. It's not the original frame, but the paintings are there. The paintings are. You look at the bottom left, the bottom right. What are those? Those are the donor portraits, right? We can tell they're praying to God. They're praying to the saints. We can tell they're people from the time period the artwork was done. Above that, what do we see? Okay, based on what I just talked about a minute ago, there's the angel. There's Mary. She's got her book in front of her. There's the dove symbolizing Jesus. It's the Annunciation, right? So you recognize that now, and you'll see that showing up in other artwork. There's words on the painting. They're upside down, okay? Mary, she's saying things. It's literally written out like a cartoon, okay? They're upside down. Why are they upside down? Who's above Mary and the angel? God's above Mary, okay, and the angel. So God can look down and read what Mary's saying because the words are written upside down, so he can read them, okay? So that's what's going on there. So it's pretty cool. And then you want to know the term Grisaille, or be aware of it. You want to understand what I'm saying. Grisaille means gray, but it means this kind of grayish way of painting. So the two figures in the bottom center are paintings. They're not sculptures. They're not statues. They're not made of stone, but they're painted to look like stone. And so we call that Grisaille. It means gray. So the whole outside of the altarpiece is painted, okay, So here's the inside of an altarpiece, right? Bright colors, right? Okay. A lot of times the outside of the altarpiece is painted to look sort of calm and not as bright and not as colorful. So then on the few days a year that the altarpieces were open in the churches, this is for a church, by the way, it's not private, it's not somebody's home. Most of the time the altarpieces were closed. So it was a really big deal. It was really visually spectacular. So on the feast days and the other days in the year on the church calendar, when you open them, it really impacted people. It really meant something. So go from this grisaille of the statues, the painted statues and sort of ivory colors of Mary and the angel Gabriel and that kind of thing, to opening it up. And then these oil colors are just popping, and this thing, again, like I said, is huge. Okay. It's 11 by 15 feet. So twice as tall, more than twice as tall as we are when you go, or excuse me, twice as tall as we are, more than 3 times across. Okay. This enormous altarpiece in this church. So there's no way, unless we all get to go to Belgium, we're going to see the details in this thing. And just incredible, glowing paint. So this is open. So there's a few things I'm going to point out in the altarpiece, but the textbook doesn't cover all the details. I'm not going to ask you to know all the details. So there's a few things I'm going to kind of zone in on. But let me just real quick before I go that, just mention what you are seeing here, because it's just spectacular. So Adam is on the far left in the Garden of Eden. Then the choir there, the choir's on the next to him, and then that's Mary as the Queen of Heaven. So the Virgin Mary. Then after she dies, she's in heaven, at the right hand of God. So that's Mary as the Queen of Heaven. Then there's God the Father in the center, and there's one of the saints there. That's Saint John on our right. And then see the pipe organ, and then Eve is over on the far right. But remember, they're as tall as we are. Okay, so these figures that look small on the screen, when you see them in real life, they're as big as human figures. And then in the bottom center, that's Jesus as the Lamb of God. I know it's teeny tiny, but then the saints, the people are coming from the 4 corners of the earth, and then other people are coming in to worship Jesus. Okay, and then there's a well. The very first artwork I showed you, I had Moses and it had the well. Okay, there's a well down there at the center, which is that whole idea of the well representing the life of Christ. Okay, and the water, water symbolism in Christian imagery. So that's what we've got in this amazing altarpiece. So super colorful. We want to know that Jan van Eyck was internationally famous. That's something new. Okay, and we're going to see that in this chapter. People going south of the Alps, north of the Alps, traveling, becoming superstars. We'll see that over the next few semesters. God the Father, like I said, Mary the Queen of Heaven, John the Baptist. Those are the 3 central figures, the kind of most spectacular figures there. Now, here's the last thing I want you to know about this. Think about this for a moment. Okay, in the book of Genesis, in the Christian Old Testament, okay, there's Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. Okay. And then they sin and God throws them out of the Garden of Eden. And then they go out and they have Cain and Abel and people come from there and all that kind of stuff. So in the Garden of Eden, they were naked because they weren't embarrassed. Like little babies today, they just take off their little diapers and run around. Okay. So once they left the Garden of Eden, they were embarrassed to realize they were naked, and they made clothes and they wore clothes. So here's what we can never know about Eve. When Jan van Eyck painted Eve, Adam's on the left, Eve's on the far right. When you get pregnant, when women get pregnant, there's a line on their tummy. Okay, it's called the linea nigra. It means the black line from their navel on down. She's got the line on her tummy. People at this time most of the time didn't have enough food to eat. So when you show somebody looking kind of fat, it's not an insult, it's actually a compliment. So people are going to be painted kind of looking fat, men or women, but it doesn't mean they're being shown pregnant. It means they're just shown with food. So we don't know. If she's in the Garden of Eden, she wouldn't be pregnant because that didn't happen until later on. And when she's naked, she's in the Garden of Eden, but she looks pregnant and she's got the line on her tummy. So it's one of these cool things that we'll never know. Our historians will never know whether she's pregnant or not, but that's a good extra credit. Let me tell you, that's a good extra credit. So that'll show up on your first test. A question about what could suggest Eve is pregnant. It's the line on her tummy. It's not just that she's fat, because we'll see that elsewhere. But the line on her tummy, what tells us she shouldn't be pregnant, or what makes it a mystery, is because she's naked, which means she's still in the Garden of Eden. Just one of these things that we love to think about, many years later. So these oil paints are gorgeous. So this is just that littleish, not little, but littleish bottom section there. And then when you go zoom in close, you can see the work on this was amazing for these people. So you go to church, it's only open on the feast days, and then you see this type of thing. So I mentioned the Lamb of God down there. So please know that this meticulous painting on wood, okay, not on canvas, which flexes and bends a little bit, but painting on wood, painting in oils is really kind of the hallmark, really kind of the big thing about Flemish painting in the 1400s. 15th century means 1400s, okay? So just a really awesome work. Last one on Jan van Eyck. This painting is in the National Gallery, London. It's not very big, okay? It's little less than 3 feet tall, a little less than 2 feet wide. So these people are not life size. So I said that there's a lot of money in the wool trade, right? So if I'm in Flanders, the wool is being brought over and this is being woven into cloth. I said I need bankers to help maintain all the financials on this. So the guy on the left here, he's from Italy. So we'll be talking a lot about the Medici in the next couple of chapters. The Medici is a family in Italy who are international bankers. So the way bankers worked at the time, they didn't just trust people, they kept it in the family, okay? And there's a little bit of today, the idea of like the mafia and stuff, right? That's a family thing. Well, it's not the mafia, but this kind of thing existed in real life where these families would send family members to the other parts of the countries, and the family members communicated with each other. So he's an Italian guy. It's important if you understand he's an Italian guy in Flanders, in the northern part of Europe, okay? So he's in a lot of money. He's also buying into the new style, okay? So he's buying into the way paintings were being done in Flanders. So here's the mystery of this painting. This is another one that's a mystery to us. So if I blew this up, and you can do this in your textbook, most of these paintings, this one for sure, you can just Google it, get a good high-res image and Google it and blow it up and look at it. The center of the painting is a convex mirror. It's a round mirror. We see people reflected in it. Not only the man and woman here, but we see other people reflected in it. Above the round mirror, we see the signature of the artist, really big. Where do you go? You're seeing it on screen right now because it's in the notes, but where do you go where people hold hands and there's other people they're watching and then you sign something? It's a wedding. So even in the 1400s, people got married, they had witnesses, and then they signed the marriage certificate. So this could symbolize the idea that the artist is saying symbolically, I attended your wedding or I witnessed your wedding, okay? That's one possibility. And there's some things that would suggest that. Dogs are a really old symbol of fidelity, of loyalty, okay? When you take off your shoes, those are shoes in the bottom left. That's a symbol I'm doing something holy. I've taken off my shoes in front of God. The bed is not the bed that you would think about. The bed's actually a show bed. It's actually in the main room of the house. It's actually not in the bedroom, as weird as that may seem to us. This is an expensive item. It's like, why do I have 2 Lamborghinis in my garage, which I don't have? But why is it because I need? No, it's to show I can spend that kind of money. So the bed's actually a showpiece. So they're not in the room where they lived as husband and wife. They're in the public room where the guy would have done business. So, but it could be a marriage. It could be a marriage. And there's some other symbolism in here. There's candles. I mentioned candles before and different things. But another possibility, the way they're holding hands is the way that you would make a business deal. So it could be that the guy on the left is saying, while I'm gone, because the family, right? The family, we got to do our banking. My wife's going to be in charge of business here. So it could symbolize the idea of I'm trusting my wife to do that. Okay, so those are 2 possibilities. A third possibility is it could have been painted after she married this guy. And then later on, we don't know the woman's name. That's why I'm not saying her name. We don't know her name, but we know she died later on having a baby. So this could have been painted as a symbol, after she died. That was done a lot. Hey, I want this memory of my wife or my husband. Okay. The one thing we're almost certain of, so please know those three options. Could be showing him getting married, could be shown as a business deal, could be a memorial, a remembrance of her after she died. The one thing we're pretty certain of is that she's not pregnant. What business is this guy in? He's in the business of banking. What are the banks getting wealthy from? The wool trade. What is she showing off in her outfit that's spectacular? She's showing off a spectacular wool dress. Okay. So this is a kind of, if you go to a trade show, if you're in fashion design, if you go to a trade show, they show fabric, right? And they show, designs. This could be doing that. So we're 99% certain she's not pregnant. Okay. But definitely no, this is an oil painting. This thing is amazing. I mean, it's incredibly, he's just really good at working with oil. So this one, by the way, this is one of the most famous paintings ever. It's called Giovanni Arnolfini and his wife, but we also call it the Arnolfini wedding portrait, even though we're not sure if it's a wedding. So that's Jan van Eyck. You see the details there. You can see the mirror with the reflections. Just really cool. Really cool stuff. Okay. So let's go on to a couple other artists for this chapter. This is an artist, Roger van der Weyden. He's also Flemish, so I won't keep repeating that. The painting shows Mary with baby Jesus. A lot of Marys and baby Jesus, right? And it shows an artist painting Mary and baby Jesus. So this, if you know the term meta, not like the company, but the idea, this is a really meta painting. So Roger van der Weyden, the artist, okay, the guy who painted this, okay, he's painting it for the guild. He's painting it for the artist guild. So his colleagues, right, who are also painters, said, hey, we want this for our guild. That's the way it was done. You had your guild hall and you did your business and all that kind of stuff. So what makes sense for the artist guild is a painting about painting, okay? Does that make sense? Like I said, we're really meta here. And then it may be that Roger, the artist, put his own portrait in here. He could have used multiple mirrors to get the side view of his own head, okay? So again, which would also be really meta. Okay. So it's definitely the idea of St. Luke. We know that for sure. The other parts are like guessing it a little bit, but we know it's definitely the idea of St. Luke, who in the mythology of the time or in the beliefs of the Middle Ages was the patron saint of artists. He was the saint for artists. And then definitely know, a couple of things I definitely want you to know about this. It shows a wealthy home, not of the time from the Bible, not from 2,000 years ago, but what a wealthy home would have looked like in the time the artist was painting in the 1400s. And that happens a lot. That's done a lot. So we see all the fabrics and stuff, right? We're all familiar with that now from the other things. And so what he's doing, the artist is doing in the painting, what St. Luke is doing in the painting, he's using what's called silver point. So please underline that in your notes. And let me explain it if you're not familiar with it. And you can look it up if you want to see more details on it. But before you have pencils like we use, one of the ways that you could draw was take an actual silver stick made of the metal. And if you take a car key and you key somebody's car, which you shouldn't do, but if you key somebody's car, if you've seen like a nail scraping on a metal surface or something, it leaves that sort of gray, silvery color. If you're familiar with what I'm talking about, or a fork on something when it goes across a piece of metal or something in a kitchen or something, it gets a kind of silvery sort of tone. That's what we call silver point. So before they had graphite pencils, the kind of pencils we use today, silver point was one of the ways to draw. So to do a planning for your painting. So he's doing silver point. So look, if you're not familiar with that or know what I'm talking about, please look that up, look up the definition on that. And then the symbolism in here, which you can't see because it's in the details of the woodwork, but the symbolism, please to know that Jesus was seen as the new Adam, okay? So when I have Adam and Eve, the idea of Adam and Eve, then Jesus is the idea of the new Adam. So a lot of the artwork could combine the idea of the Old Testament, old Adam and Eve, with the new Adam and baby Jesus. So that's what's happening here. Some of the details in the painting, which we can't see on screen, show the idea of Adam and Eve and the serpent. And then Mary has the new Adam, the birth of Jesus. And again, maybe a self-portrait. Not certain, but maybe a self-portrait. We just don't know. We just don't know for sure. Here's the other painting by Roger. Look at this carefully. Okay, there's a little bit larger screen view of it. Look at this carefully. Look at this in the textbook. Incredible work with that oil paint on wood. So lots and lots of implied textures. So you definitely want to understand that term because it's just paint on wood, but the implied textures of the different fabrics that we're seeing here. And see the angel on the top, or the figure on the top in particular, see how his purplish white garment is just twisting and bending. It looks like it's got a lot of starch in it. And then the other fabrics here, again, incredible implied texture that artists get with the oil paint. So here's the terms you want to know. You want to know triptych, like I said, is an altarpiece that has 3 parts to it. So we're only seeing one of the 3 parts here. Triptych is an altarpiece with 3 parts to it. You want to know a deposition, and you'll see more of these. A deposition is a painting where after Jesus has died, he's being taken down off the cross and put into his tomb. So deposition scenes are frequent in medieval art and then the Renaissance art that we're studying. And then notice here, this was painted for the Archers Guild, for people who made bows and arrows, particularly crossbows, if you're familiar with those, okay? So there's a crossbow, just a kind of generic image that I put on the top right-hand side of the screen. See the little artwork in the corners there? Okay, see how that sort of crossbow shape in the left hand? And then look at Mary. She's in the blue. Her body's on the ground. Look at the curving shape of her body. And look at her arms. You see that? And look at Jesus. That's not accidental. That's purposeful. The artists started thinking about these things. And the guild is thinking about them. And look at his arms. They mimic the crossbow shapes. Isn't that cool? How they do that. And then you can see other things in here when we do our formal elements, or your essay on the elements of art. You can see how the artist has created an entire series of sort of circles that go through this. See the woman on the right, again, with her arms making that kind of similar crossbow shape, and then her body bending and flowing around. So this is really cool composition. The other thing I want you to know about this is it's painted instead of spatial recession, as if this goes back in space, like we'll see in some of the later paintings. This is painted where it's really made like it's a very shallow stage. You see how the gold behind the figures makes it look like they're in this very shallow space, right? Which really intensifies the emotion. It puts it right up here with us, instead of looking like they're further back and they're further removed. Like Mary on the bottom there, she fell forward. She's not, it's a painting, but it would feel like she's falling right into where we are. So it amplifies the emotions. And then implied textures I talk about, only possible with oil paint to get these kind of implied textures. Here painting on wood. So a few more as we wrap up this chapter. This is a Last Supper. And again, in this chapter, we see a lot of things for the first time that we'll go back and see more of. So the Last Supper is when Jesus gathers with his disciples, and then the next day, or that evening, and then into the next day, he's taken and then he's crucified. So it's the last time he's together with his disciples having a meal. So there's a lot of artwork from Europe, 1400s, 1500s, 1600s, showing the Last Supper. The most famous is Leonardo da Vinci's Last Supper. So this is one of several scenes that we'll see. So in these Last Suppers, a lot of times the 12 disciples who are with Jesus are broken up into groups. So keep that in mind. We'll see different versions of that, different ways they play with that. See how that tabletop is tilted, where it's like really bending into our space. So here, kind of playing with, I'll put 6, 3 on that side, 3 on that side, and I'll put, 4 back there, then I only end up with 2 left over. Now the standing people, these are the people, again, who paid the money to have this painting done. So they want, again, they're donors. They want to be in the portrait. So they had themselves painted in as servants serving the meal to Jesus and his disciples. Okay. So that's what's going on there. And where it says Jesus blessing the bread, that's important, because if you're familiar with the Christian church, where you have what's called the Eucharist, or you have what's called the Lord's Supper, the symbolism of it is recreating the idea of the Last Supper. So the painting of the Last Supper here, and again, we'll see different versions. This particular version of it is Jesus doing it as the Eucharist. And we'll see other versions where different things are happening. Now, here's what really important that I want you to take away from this. I want you to know the subject matter that I just discussed, but I also want you to know that we're seeing an early version here, what's called linear perspective, okay? So linear perspective, the artist can take architecture, or they can just take general things that they're painting. But the idea is that just like in real life, it's going to show lines coming together. So the example to put in your notes, the example to think about, if you go out and you look at a train track, that's the clearest example where I know the train track stays exactly the same distance apart, the 2 rails, but as they go further away, they look like they're coming together. Or if I'm in any good sized room, I look at the ceiling, it looks like it's getting smaller as it goes back. So people had always seen that in the world around them, But artists realized in the 1400s, hey, if we put this in our paintings, we can really create the illusion of space. We can really start getting into that. So this is an early version of that. So please know linear perspective, okay? Linear perspective. And then linear perspective, these lines are coming together where they would all come hit is what we call the vanishing point. So here, Dietrich Bautz, if you really tried to line these up, they're a little bit off. He's still sort of playing with it. So these are my lines I put on there. He's kind of playing with that technique. But please know that, because when you get to the Leonardo da Vinci Last Supper, it's like the perfect version of that, of linear perspective. Okay. But I want you to know it's playing with this. This is a photograph in my online class where they're posing for the painting on the left. Okay. So this is just from the last semester. And one of the things that I want you to notice here, see the guy in the center, I'm compositing images. I'm playing with it to get things to line up because it's not quite perfect, right? But also notice how the guy in the center, I made him bigger. We're going to see that showing up again. It's called hierarchy of scale. So it's a really old idea. If somebody's more important, I make them bigger. So if you're looking and going, is it Jesus bigger than the other people? He actually is. So that's a really old idea that we'll still see showing up in a few of our artworks. And you can see on the right, just by the way, how hard it is as bodies, as real life bodies, to match some of these poses in the painting. We'll see more of that. We'll see more of that later on. So here's a painting that's big. Okay. Here's what's important about this painting. It's done in the north. It's done north of the Alps using this new oil paint technique, but it's commissioned, means somebody ordered it, who's south of the Alps, who's in Italy. So keep this painting in mind when we go to the next chapter, because we're going to be in Italy and we're going to be talking about the same time period and sort of how the people are learning back and forth as they're going back and forth across the Alps. So I'm sorry, it's a terrible, terrible slide. I can't get a good image of this, but this painting goes south of the Alps, this big, big, big altarpiece. Okay. And today it's still in south of the Alps. It's still in the Uffizi Gallery, which is in Florence, Italy. There's that hierarchy of scale. See how Mary in the center, and you recognize her now, right? You're kind of, hey, I know what Mary looks like. You see her lilies, et cetera, all the details there. And then baby Jesus, she's worshiping him. So instead of holding him, which would be one form of symbolism that we'll see, she's worshiping him. And see the hierarchy of scale, how little some of the other things are, because they're not as important. The other thing I want you to know about this, and again, please look at this in the textbook to really pick it out. You also see the donor portraits, right? Far right-hand side, far left-hand side. So you recognize these things. You already know all these things. But what really astounded the people in Italy when this painting was brought to them was the oil painting technique. That was something new for them. Okay, they were using fresco and tempera. So this was something new for them to see this naturalism. Okay, so it really, really astounded them, the oil painting, and then how the oil painting could be used to create this naturalism, the sense of implied texture, the way I can get lower values, darker colors, the way I can get these warmer colors. So really keep in mind the shepherds here, the three guys on the right, okay? Because they're not pretty, right? They're not these elegant, decorative figures. They're like people who were out there tending their sheep, and then they came to see baby Jesus, came straight out of the field to see him. So this would have astounded the Italians. It would have been very, very different than what they'd seen previously. Can you see the ox and the donkey on the left, by the way? Those are those low values, those dark colors and those glowing colors that I get with oil paintings. And the tilted ground I mentioned, this is a painting, but it feels like one of the mystery plays where real people would have actually put on costumes and posed. They would have been holding still, they wouldn't have been moving, and recreated this symbolism of baby Jesus and of Mary and Joseph and all the different details. So this gives us that same feeling, that same vibe of what the real life mystery plays would have been like as well. So know that term, hierarchy of scale. If figures are bigger, they're more important. We're seeing kind of the last bit of it, and then it's going to go away in the art that we'll study, in the European art that we'll study. So it's the last little bit that we'll see. Okay, the last couple of paintings for this chapter. This is just a really odd diptych. So again, there's two parts, there's two paintings, and then there would have been the framing around it, which we're not seeing on the screen. So the two parts to it are in two different museums today. So this was what was painted to go together. These two parts go together. So on the left, and this is French. This is the first artwork we're seeing that's French. On the left is the treasurer, one of the king's top people. And the next to him is a saint. Okay, so he's a real live person, and then an imaginary painting of the saint next to him. And then on the right is Mary with baby Jesus, but a totally different look than any Mary and baby Jesus we've seen up to this point. So we got the baby, we got Mary, but we also know she's Queen of Heaven, right? Because she's got her crown on, she's on a throne, etc., etc. And that color is real. That really strange red-blue background. And we'll, when you're doing your elements of art essay, you'll talk about primary colors. Those are two of our primaries, red and blue, are two of our primaries. So just a very odd painting here. So the one on the left, the painting on the left, the reason he's holding a rock is saints had what were called their attributes. So the man holding the rock on top of the book, an attribute would be some symbol to tell you which saint it was. So in this case, he was killed by being stoned. So he's holding his rock as a symbol of that. So please know these go together. These two go together and were originally part of one artwork that you would have seen in this case. So please know it's St. Stephen holding his rock, and then we've got this royal treasure. The other thing who's the actual man in the red there. The other thing I want you to know is that we're seeing, this is in France, but if I went to the Flemish art, when I went up one country from France, right, where they started doing this 3/4 view, like I already showed you the painting on the right, we're seeing that again. So we're getting into that new kind of naturalism, that new kind of way of showing folks here. And this I'm probably more than you need to know, but this is a cool, strange, weird, sad story. So the right-hand side of the diptych of the altarpiece is very common to show Mary nursing baby Jesus. And it symbolized that Jesus, when he was born, that he wasn't just a God. He wasn't just a mythical figure, but he had become fully human. It's called incarnation. And that's why Jesus is also shown without any clothes on, to show he was a full little baby boy. So it wasn't scandalous to show Mary nursing the baby or to show the breast of Mary. But sometimes other things went into play. So in this case, we know that the woman who posed for the painting, or who was the base of the painting, was actually the mistress to the King of France. Okay, so be aware of that. And then furthermore, they now know, it was rumored when she died after having 3 children with the king, and she was pregnant with the 4th child, it was rumored at the time that she had been poisoned because of the whole political thing and this kind of stuff. And recent research in the last few years of the remains of Agnes Sorel, have documented that indeed she was poisoned. And so this is after her death that this painting is done, showing her as Virgin Mary with a baby. And in real life, there was this real person, and she really did have children with the King of France. So please know that there's a whole bunch of stuff that's going on there. And then on the screen right there, the forensic scientist, if you know where you can take a person's skull, and go back and recreate their appearance, based on the shape of their skull. And then if you can have information through DNA or otherwise about their hair color and whatnot, that's a recreation. That's an accurate recreation, as best we can tell, of what Agnes Sorel actually looked like in real life, which is kind of, she doesn't exactly look like the painting, of course, but kind of spooky and kind of interesting to realize that. So here's the last slide. A lot of terms on here. So please look at these terms in your textbook. All these terms are in your textbook. In printmaking, it's not super fun to try to show you a bunch of images because they're all going to kind of look the same. So please know these terms, and I'll go through them as well. So this is a German artist named Martin Schongauer. You want to know that printmaking is incredibly important. So underline that in your notes, underline that in your thought process. All the paintings I've shown you, every single painting, only a small number of people ever saw these paintings in real life, okay? Like when I am the treasurer to the King of France, this painting is for me, and I have it. If something is in a castle, or a king has it, or even in church, only a small number of people ever actually see the paintings in real life, because paintings don't travel. There's only one of them. So when I can start making multiple copies, that is a massive, massive, massive change. It's as big a deal for the time period as the invention of the internet is today. It's that big a deal from the sharing of information. So printmaking and printing books and all that other kind of stuff that you'd study in history class. So you want to know that printmaking is a massive way of sharing information, particularly visual information like artwork. It's also much, much cheaper because it's processed. It's hard to do. But when I set up my printing plate, okay, my metal plate or wooden plate, depending on what I'm doing, then I can make many impressions. I can make many copies. And it's also relatively cheap. Paper is relatively cheap, and it's a big deal. It's portable. I can pick up a piece of paper and carry it around a lot easier than I can carry around a bunch of heavy paintings. So for all those reasons, it's cheaper, because it's portable, because it's using common material, then I can reach wider audiences. Okay. So put in your notes, it's like the invention of the internet. It's like the invention of the internet was for the 20th century, for the 1500s, okay, for the 1400s. It's that big a deal. Here's a couple of technical terms, and please look these up. If I put these on a test, please look these up so you're familiar with them, because I want you to know these terms. Engraving is one way of making prints. Okay, there's a couple of different ways of making it, but engraving is the one I want you to focus on the most. When I pick up a piece of green money, a piece of American money, it's been printed with engraving. Okay, so in engraving, I take a tool, it's called a burin, B-U-R-I-N. I push it into this copper plate or this metal plate. Okay, it's really hard to do, but I get these incredibly fine, detailed lines. So again, grab a piece of money and look at it. Thomas Jefferson, whoever you want to look at on your piece of money. All these little teeny tiny lines, that's from the engraving. Okay, that's from the engraving process. And there's a bunch of other stuff they do with money. Another term you want to know is what we call values, lights and darks, right? So when I make the lines, I get darker areas where the ink is printing off, and then I can create these implied textures. Then the last set of terms to know, I listed them on there. Please look those up. Intaglio has to do with putting marks into a metal plate. That's called intaglio. Relief is when I print where something stands up. And then etching and woodblock, because these are all things we'll see this semester. So please make sure that you're looking at those. So that is the end of our video. Thanks so much. Talk to you later, everybody. Take care.